Hello, my name is Sinclair Davidson. I'm from the RMIT Blockchain Innovation Hub. Today I'm going to give a lecture on an introduction to distributed ledger technology or blockchain technology. So the RMIT Blockchain Innovation Hub was set up a couple of years ago. We are a group of social scientists, economists, lawyers, political scientists, sociologists, historians, all looking at how this technology is going to completely revolutionize our society, our economy, our way of doing things, and more or less be a change that we haven't seen since probably the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. So what I'm not going to be talking about today is gory technical detail. I'm not going to explain to you how the blockchain works in any sort of technical sense, just to give you a taste of what it is so that we can actually get into, what I think are probably the far more interesting and exciting things. What impact is it actually going to have on our society and our economy? Now, some people always find this a bit strange. They kind of think, well, you have to understand the technology itself before you can actually use it. Well, that is just simply not true. If you think about how do you know how your mobile phone works? Do you know how an aeroplane flies? Do you really know how an internal combustion engine works? Nonetheless, you use your mobile phone for all sorts of things. You know how to drive a motor car. You know how to operate a television. So we use technology in our daily lives all the time, even though we don't actually know the gory technical detail of how it actually works. I'm also not going to be giving you investment advice. I can't honestly say to you which cryptocurrencies you should or should not buy. I can't tell you which investment opportunities you should or shouldn't undertake. What I can say to you, however, is that you should always think very carefully about undertaking any sorts of investment. And in this particular space, if the blockchain application is not actually quite obvious as to why you need a blockchain for whatever it is that the project is proposing, you should probably think maybe you're not going to invest here. Always bearing in mind, early investors in most new innovations and technologies end up losing money. So be very careful. I'm not giving any investment advice today, and certainly not talking about gory technical details. What I am going to talk to you about is some important economic issues and thoughts and ideas which underpin the blockchain and distributed ledger technology, and of course how they interact with each other. So I'm going to start off by pointing you to a wonderful YouTube clip from the movie Matilda, from the book of the same name, Matilda, by Roald Dahl. Roald Dahl is a magnificent author. If you haven't read his works, you should certainly treat yourself to doing so. He has two genres that he writes in. One can almost be described as children's books. So Matilda would be described as a children's book. I think adults can enjoy it as well. Then other books, for example, the Big Friendly Giant, Witches, all those sorts of books. So there was one particular genre that he wrote in, and the other genre that he wrote in was sort of dark short stories for adults. Both of them, both genres that he wrote in, was simply magnificent. Now, in this particular clip, and I strongly advise go to YouTube and have a look at it. In this particular clip, we have a very, very common economic problem. And that common economic problem revolves around information and trust. And in the story, Matilda's father is a second-hand car dealer, and he's a dodgy second-hand car dealer, and he's taking his children to show them his second-hand car yard, and in that he has what he calls a junker, which is a terrible, broken down, old, decrepit motor car that he's bought for $100. And he says to his children, "What do I do with this car?" And he adds on 2 zeros and he says, "I sell her for $10,000. And then he goes through the process of gluing the bumpers back onto the car instead of welding them on, putting sawdust into the transmission so that the gears don't jar when they change, winding back the odometer with a two-directional drill. And the little girl Matilda is horrified, and she's saying, "But Daddy, you're a crook, you're cheating, this is illegal, you can't do this." And the father, the Danny DeVito character, who's always deliciously evil in all the roles that he plays, looks at her and says, "Nobody became rich by being honest." Now, of course, that is simply not true, but nonetheless, the whole notion and idea of the dodgy second-hand car dealer is a wonderful way to think about one of the most central and profound problems in economics. And in economics, which is a discipline which looks at how people coordinate trade between themselves, how do you know who to trade with? How do you know that the person you are trading with is honest, that they are not selling you a bad second-hand car? And in the economic literature, this is well known as the market for lemons. And of course, we then start telling stories about how we overcome these trust problems and information problems in an economy. But this particular YouTube clip sets out the problem precisely. It is a wonderful learning experience. If you look at it from an economics perspective, you actually see the economic problem of trust and information being set out so very nicely. So strongly urge you, go to YouTube clip and watch it. It's just a couple of minutes long. So with that in the background, let's start talking directly about the blockchain and Bitcoin itself. Now, in the 1990s, there was this notion of the Holy Grail to go out and discover something really valuable and important, and there were a group of computer scientists known as cypherpunks who actually wanted to create a digital money. Now, they didn't want to create just any old digital money because effectively we've got digital money already. They wanted to create a native currency that lived on the internet and it was also not reliant upon the state. They were libertarian type individuals or anti-state type individuals, and so they wanted to create a money, a digital money that did not rely on people having to trust the state or have state involvement in the creation of this currency. Now, a lot of the early attempts to create a digital money failed. DigiCash, for example, went bankrupt. eGold was eventually shut down by legal action. PayPal is still around, but PayPal's more of a payments system mechanism than a digital money itself. But PayPal was first designed and created for Palm Pilots. Now, you probably don't know what a Palm Pilot is, but think of it as being an early version of your mobile phone, except that it was actually a handheld little computer type thing as opposed to a communications device that was also a computer type thing. But they ran into some serious problems around creating a digital money. And the first problem that they ran into is the fact that there is this double spending problem. Now, if you were actually in a classroom with me, what I would do is I would reach into my wallet right now, take out a $50 bill, and say to people, I can't double spend this $50 bill because while I've got this $50 bill in my hand, I've got it. And if I give it to you in return for some goods and services, you have now got it. I can't give the same $50 bill to two different people because I've only got one $50 bill with me. Think, however, of a digital money. A digital money is effectively only a digital file. And it is cheap and easy to perfectly replicate digital files. So imagine the situation. You take out your phone and you take a photograph of yourself. You then have a copy of that photograph on your phone. You like that photograph so much that you upload a copy of it to your Instagram account. So now there are two copies of the photograph, one on your Instagram account, one on your phone. You like it so much you upload it to your Facebook account. So you've now got perfect copies of the same photograph. Your mum sees the photograph on Facebook. She likes it so much that she downloads it onto her machine. So now there are 4 copies of precisely the same document. Now, if I could make precisely identical copies of my $50 bill, I would then have an explosion in the money supply, which would very, very quickly lead to an inflation problem. So the issue that we face is that we actually have to have money that you can only spend once. Now, of course, I understand we'd all like to have an infinite supply of money ourselves, but we all also, at an intellectual level, understand that that's probably not a good idea. So we want to have a digital money that can only be spent once, that you can't actually make a perfect copy of it each and every single time and then double spend, multiple spend the same currency. Now, how we solve this problem of double spending in reality, in the real economy, is by actually having centralization. So we have governments which issue money, and we'll talk a lot about that further on in the lecture. We have governments that issue money. We have banking systems which track money. We have mechanisms whereby I hand over a bill and the bill is actually numbered. It's not quite identical to anyone else. We have laws against counterfeiting and so on and so forth. So what we have is a trusted third party. And if you want to, you can put trusted third party into scare quotes, because we will be talking about how you can't always trust third parties, but let's abstract from that for the minute. We have centralization as a solution to the double spending problem. Centralization, however, has its own problems. How trusted is the trusted source? The other problem, of course, is that there is a single point of security weakness. Now, you've probably all heard of or even seen the wonderful James Bond movie Goldfinger. Now, Goldfinger was made in the 1960s when the world was on the Bretton Woods system, or the dollar standard, where everybody linked their currencies to the value of the US dollar, and the US dollar in turn was linked to the value of gold, and the United States government had a huge big stock of gold, which they used to keep in Fort Knox. Well, apparently they used to keep it in Fort Knox. Some historians now say there wasn't really all this gold and so on, but for the purposes of our story, all the gold was in Fort Knox, and the James Bond villain, Goldfinger, was going to steal the gold out of Fort Knox. So that was like a single point of weakness. He was going to end up stealing all the world's gold. Other things which make digital currencies hard and which have attracted government attention is criminality. People use digital currencies for criminal behavior. Bearing in mind, of course, they also use regular money for criminal behavior as well. Security, I mean, how do you stop people from stealing it? It's hard to tax and hard to regulate. Now, for some people, being hard to tax and hard to regulate is a feature, and for other people, it is a bug. Now, irrespective of whether you think it is a feature or a bug, we have to bear in mind, however, it does make the creation of viable digital currencies quite difficult. So in November of 2008, a pseudonymous person or group of people calling themselves Satoshi Nakamoto published what was called a white paper on the internet, where they solved the double spending problem and simultaneously solved the centralization problem. Now, Satoshi Nakamoto, the pseudonymous person or group of individuals, probably is or was, assuming they're still alive, probably was a computer scientist, and so they think of the centralization problem as being the Byzantine generals problem. Now, the Byzantine generals problem works along these lines. You are the Byzantine emperor, and your armies are attacking a castle, and the castle is surrounded by your armies, and your armies each has a general in charge of it, and you want to communicate to all of your generals to attack the castle at the same time. But you don't trust all your generals, and some of the generals may actually subvert your message, but you don't know which generals are loyal and which generals are not loyal, and so you have to come up with a mechanism whereby you can communicate with all of them and they can't subvert the message. So when you've got some bad actors or bad players in your system who can subvert your system, you have to be able to have a decentralized solution to that particular problem. What Satoshi Nakamoto did was simultaneously come up with a mechanism whereby his digital currency, Bitcoin, could not be double spent and could have a decentralized mechanism that resolved the centralization problem. So in January of 2009, Satoshi Nakamoto then started mining Bitcoin. He started putting transactions onto the internet, working off his particular system, and that is the beginning of the Bitcoin blockchain. So Bitcoin is the name of the currency that Satoshi Nakamoto invented, and the blockchain is the solution to the double spending problem and the centralization problem. So we have to ask ourselves, who is or was this Satoshi Nakamoto person? And the answer is we don't know. Now, obviously, there are people out there in the world who do know who Satoshi Nakamoto is or was. They are keeping very quiet. There are people who claim to be Satoshi Nakamoto, but they're unable to credibly demonstrate that they are this person. But certainly, who he is or was or who they were is not well known or generally understood. But what is known is that Satoshi Nakamoto holds about 1 million Bitcoin, which on current prices are worth $8.9 billion US. Now, those Bitcoin are locked up in various accounts which are observable on the internet, and they haven't been touched in several years, which suggests that either we have a very, very shy billionaire on our hands, or that they have lost their private keys to access those Bitcoin. I certainly hope that is not the case. That would have been incredibly frustrating. Or that Satoshi Nakamoto has passed away or moved on or is doing something completely different. But whatever it is, there's about 1 billion Bitcoin locked up in plain sight that are worth a lot of money and are not doing anything. So how should you think about the blockchain? Now, I like to show people this particular picture, and because it's so much better than saying the blockchain is magic on the internet. That's a very easy answer. It's magic. It does all these wonderful things. Well, no, it isn't magic. It lives on the internet, and it's a combination of a whole bunch of things that we already know and understand. And Satoshi Nakamoto's genius was to bring together a whole bunch of pre-existing ideas, pre-existing technologies, and mix them together in such a way to create something that is profoundly new, different, and revolutionary. Now, I'm probably going to use the word revolutionary many, many times in this lecture, but it is profoundly new, different, and revolutionary. So we have the internet, computers talking to each other. We have data. And we have shared data. We share data across the internet every single day. We send files to each other. We send emails to each other. All these things are sharing data on the internet. But what happens in a blockchain is that these shared computers, these connected computers with their shared data, reach an agreement over what the data is. So we have connected computers reaching agreement over shared data. And very often I say to people, if you can understand those three things in that very simple diagram, you can more or less understand what it is that the blockchain is doing. It is creating consensus, agreement. So what is this reach agreement over? What is consensus? Well, consensus mechanism or the agreement is, how do we decide what is or isn't on the blockchain? Once it's on the blockchain, it's there forever. And so we have the mechanism which Satoshi Nakamoto designed was the proof of work mechanism. So if you are a miner, that's the terminology, you are a miner, you are collecting transactions which occur onto the internet, just imagine. So people are trading with each other. You collect these transactions and put them into, for understanding purposes, think of it, you put them all into an Excel spreadsheet. You then want to add that Excel spreadsheet to all the other Excel spreadsheets. Let's call that a block. You want to add them to all the other previous transactions. And the way in which you do that is by solving a mathematical puzzle. Now, this particular mathematical puzzle does not have an analytical solution. So you can't solve for it by applying logic. You simply have to solve for it by applying brute strength. So you just run algorithms over and over and over and over until the puzzle is solved. Now, the way it particularly works, it's hard to solve the puzzle, but it's easy to check that the puzzle has been solved. When you solve the puzzle, you can add your block to the existing blockchain, and that's when consensus is reached. And you don't do this for free or for love, you actually do this for money. And the way in which the system rewards you, it issues you with some Bitcoin. Now, in the very beginning, the blockchain issued people with 50 Bitcoin. And then after a couple of years, that halved to 25 Bitcoin, then it halved again to 12.5 Bitcoin, and it just recently halved again to 6.25 Bitcoin. So the rate at which Bitcoin is entering into the world is falling. A lot of people sometimes call that the inflation rate, but I don't like doing that. That causes a bit of confusion around what economists think of as inflation rate. We should think of that as the issuance rate. So the issuance rate of the Bitcoin blockchain is declining over time until in the end there will be 21 million Bitcoin in total. What is the downside of Satoshi Nakamoto's proof of work mechanism? It burns a lot of electricity. Now, as I'm going to talk about a little bit more in a while, is that what the blockchain is doing, the system which keeps track of the money, the Bitcoin, what it's doing is it's actually turning electricity into trust. Now, that's actually a feature, but nonetheless, it does burn a lot of electricity, and a lot of people are concerned about the amount of electricity that the blockchain burns. So you will often hear a statistic along the lines, the blockchain burns enough electricity to power, and people normally pick a country, so it might be Sweden or Nigeria or Ireland or somewhere or the other. They will pick a country, and then they will say, this is how much that electricity costs to generate, and this is how much the blockchain is burning, and it's very wasteful. Now, whether or not it is wasteful or not depends upon the value that's being created. If the blockchain is creating more value than the electricity that it's burning, then that actually becomes a value proposition. Now, the other thing to bear in mind, this is a new technology and a new innovation, and new technologies and new innovations invariably are more expensive when they start out. So we now know how much electricity needs to be burnt in order to create a certain amount of trust, and so we can start economizing. And one of the ways in which people have started economizing is by coming up with an alternative mechanism. Instead of solving a problem in proof of work, we have proof of stake. Now, proof of stake, what happens here is that we no longer have miners, we have validators. And what validators do, same thing as miners, they listen out for transactions, they put them together in a block, they add the block to the blockchain. If they do that properly, correctly, accurately, with no bad behavior, they can continue to be validators. If they don't do that, then they are slashed. And so what happens is we might have stakers who monitor validators, who put money on the table to ensure that the validators are doing their jobs properly. And if the validators don't do their jobs properly, then the stakers have their stake in the system slashed. So, for example, you put $100 on the table, and if your validator behaves well, you get your $100 back plus some reward. But if you don't, if your validator doesn't behave badly, then you only get back, say, $95. So it creates financial incentives to monitor. So what a proof of stake system is doing, it's turning financial capital into trust. What a mining system is doing, or a proof of work system is doing, is turning electricity into trust. But what's important is that something is getting turned into trust, and that's actually becomes an important part of our story. But still keeping on with the basic idea, what we have here is a centralized system and a decentralized system. On the right-hand side, in our centralized system, we have all those devices, computers, phones, tablets, what have you, all connect to a central server. Now, think about reading your emails off your mobile phone. You go onto your mobile phone, you click on your email account. What it actually does is, those emails are probably not living on your phone. What it does is it connects you to a central server where all your emails live. If that central server goes down, your emails go down. If you can't connect to that central server, you can't read your emails. Think of a decentralized system, however. In that particular system, all those machines would simultaneously be speaking to each other as opposed to all simply speaking to one single server. And what happens in that particular situation is that your emails live across the network and you simply access from your phone to the nearest node where your emails could be found. There's no centralization there. There's no way to censor the whole system simultaneously. There's no single point of vulnerability. This is what the blockchain looks like. So I went to the site and I took a screen photo. If you have a copy of my slides, you can simply click on the picture and it will actually take you to the website where you can actually have a look at the blocks, you can have a look at the transactions, you can look at the fees. You can have a look at the prices of Bitcoin. You can also see Ethereum. All these other things, they're all there. You can click on the hashes and that will take you into the actual blocks itself and you will be able to see all the transactions. So strongly recommend go and have a look at it. It is a lot of fun. It's very interesting having a look at it. As I say, if you've got my slides, just click on the picture and it will take you there. This is the Genesis block, the very first block created by Satoshi Nakamoto on the 3rd of January 2009 at 6:15 in the afternoon and 5 seconds. And you can see he earned, or they earned 50 Bitcoin in return for creating the Genesis block. Again, if you just click on it, if you've got my slides, click on it and it'll take you to have a look at it. The first commercial transaction took place in 2010. Now, what happened here was that this person bought 2 pizzas. So they put up on the internet that they would pay 10,000 Bitcoin for 2 pizzas, and they kind of indicated what sort of pizzas they wanted. They wanted large ones because they like having pizza for breakfast in the morning. They like having pepperoni pizzas or onions and peppers. But maybe they would also just be happy to have 2 cheese pizzas. But there is a request. They said, look, I want 2 large pizzas and I'm prepared to pay 10,000 Bitcoin. Now, what didn't happen is the person didn't go into the store, hand over Bitcoin or transfer Bitcoin and get 2 pizzas. Somebody went to the store, paid cash for the 2 pizzas and then delivered them to this person for 10,000 Bitcoin. Now, how much is 10,000 Bitcoin? Well, today those 2 pizzas would be worth $89 million American. Now, you might say to yourself, oh my God, so much money for 2 pizzas. I hope he ate them slowly. I hope he's got them dipped in gold, all that sort of stuff. But bearing in mind, this was a proof of concept. This is like an R&D expense. Those pizzas, or those Bitcoins weren't worth that much at that time. So this could be thought of as corporate R&D. So it's not that the pizzas are worth $89 million then or now. It's that the experiment, the commercial transaction, the ability to say that this is got these Bitcoins can actually work as designed or as thought is actually the value of the experiment here. So what you say to yourself, just another person talking to you about mumbo jumbo computer stuff. What is the excitement really about? And sometimes I have people saying to me, Sinclair, this is, we've got a whole bunch of computer nerds living in their mum's basements and they can't get jobs or girlfriends and they think this is really cool, but in the real world, it's not. Or people say to me, look, this is just another mechanism for criminality, for people to buy drugs on the internet and all sorts of other things. Now, there is some truth in all of this. It is true that the blockchain did not come out of a corporate R&D division. It is true that the blockchain did not come out of some university research lab. It is true that there were some computer guys, people out there who were trying to come up with digital money, which they thought was cool. But in actual fact, the real benefit of the blockchain, the distributed ledger, is not the cryptocurrency itself. It is the technology that can be used for other things. So it is also true that criminals use cryptocurrencies, but they also use regular money, and they're probably more likely to use regular money than they are to use cryptocurrencies. So Yes, there are these very populist ideas about crypto, the blockchain and distributed ledger technology, but I don't think that we should focus on those aspects of it. We should actually focus on the real potential this technology actually has. What about the fact that right now the original, the Bitcoin blockchain, is a bit clunky, it's slow, it's hard to use, and all these sorts of stuff? Well, this is true of any new technology. So if you think back to probably one of the most profound technologies that ever been produced, the steam engine, the very first versions of the steam engine were very dangerous. They used to blow up, they used to kill people. They were also not used for locomotive power. They were used for pumping water out of mines. So we actually have a technology designed for a very specific purpose, pumping water out of mines, which after a while gets used for all sorts of other things. And this is the story with the blockchain too. It was created in order to keep track, to solve a very specific problem in money, but is actually going to be used for other things. So the excitement is about something that's actually quite boring. And that boring thing is, the excitement is about accounting. The excitement is about ledgers. How do we keep track of stuff? This is actually quite important, that we do it so instinctively that we don't actually think of as to how important it actually is. So blockchain is a revolution in ledger technology, in keeping a consensus over facts, keeping a consensus over information, keeping a consensus over value. This is what the blockchain actually does. Now, ledgers are in actual fact quite an ancient technology. They've been with us ever since our species evolved. And the very first ledgers we ever used as humans, or whatever we were before humans, are our fingers. We count on our fingers. How many sheep do you have? If you've got 2 sheep, you hold up 2 fingers. How many sheep do you have? If you've got 3, you hold up 3 fingers. So we counted things on our fingers. Our fingers are our very first ledger. Then we have counting. Then we have writing. The Israeli philosopher, historian Yuval Harari actually makes the argument that the evolution of human language relates to our ability to gossip, our ability to tell other people about our trading partners. So if you've got a dodgy second-hand car dealer, what do? You tell people about it. This is how we monitor each other. So ledgers as a technology have been with our species since we very first evolved. And of course, writing, counting, double entry bookkeeping, the Italian method it was called when it first appeared 800 to 1,000 years ago. People think that it comes from Venice. Now, it may or may not come from Venice. When Father Pacchioli was talking about double entry bookkeeping, he was describing a method that was used by business people in Venice and in Italy at the time, and had been used for some time. Now, some people make the argument that the early forms of double entry bookkeeping were not as sophisticated as they could have been. And of course, that just tells us as a technology, double entry bookkeeping scales very, very well. And it has scaled to the extent that it's been around for a long, long time, and we keep using it. So we had paper ledgers, we had double entry bookkeeping. In the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, we started moving to digital ledgers. We have distributed ledgers. But what's important from our perspective in our story is that until 2009, ledgers had to be centralized. They were always centralized. We always had to have a trusted third party looking at them. But the argument that we want to make, and that my colleagues and I do make, is that when ledger technology changes, so the economy changes. So if you're only counting on your fingers, you can only really have 10 things. If you are writing stuff, you have to trust the scribe. If you are keeping a one-sided ledger, you have to trust your business partner, you have to trust the accountant. Double entry bookkeeping basically means that your books have to balance, and if your books don't balance, then you've got a problem, you look for it. So all these sort of monitoring mechanisms of keeping touch and keeping control over trading partners and what have you actually allow the economy to expand, to become larger and larger and larger. And so what we've been arguing for the last couple of years is that blockchain industrializes trust. right now to create trust is a very time-consuming, expensive process. New technologies are also very, very expensive. But in terms of industrializing trust, we believe that the blockchain will actually revolutionize our society and our economy in the same way the Industrial Revolution revolutionized our society and our economy about 200 years ago. Now, what happened in the Industrial Revolution is that humans industrialized power. Before the Industrial Revolution, in order to have power or energy, you had to have human or animal power. You had to have humans working the pumps to pump water out of mines. Other sources of power were inefficient. So wind power, windmills, water mills, all these sorts of things were reliant on intermittent sources of energy that couldn't be stored or transported over large distances. So human power was more or less what powered the world, and animal power, what powered the world up until the Industrial Revolution. What happened after that is that we industrialized power. Now, when you industrialize power, you can move at long distances. You can do more. You can drive the change in human wealth and health and longevity and everything that's happened in the last 200 years. If you have a look at human well-being, there is a very, very sharp turning point in the last couple of 100 years because we industrialized power. What we're doing now is that we will be able to industrialize trust. And so we believe that there is going to be a massive change in our economy and in our society as a result of this. And there's the great quote: if you look back at history, every time there's been a big expansion in the world's economic activity, it was generally induced by the creation of a new form of trust. And in 2009, Satoshi Nakamoto put a new form of trust onto the internet for everybody to see and everybody to use. And so in the short 10 years, that's happened since, 11 years now, in the short 11 years since then, we have seen a lot of interest, a lot of activity, a lot of business models being tried out to actually operationalize this new form of trust. So what sort of technology are we talking about? What's going on here? Well, it could be a production technology, a new general purpose technology like computers, for example. You can use them in all sorts of ranges of things. And in that particular kind of story, we would say that the blockchain would lower production costs. Now, I don't want to say that that is probably not the biggest benefit of the blockchain, because there probably are instances where it will lower production costs. But in actual fact, there are a lot of competing databases. A lot of people actually think of the blockchain as just being a new type or a different type of database. If you are looking at the blockchain as a database, you are probably going to end up making a business mistake of basically employing something that's a little bit more expensive for what you really need. If you need a new database, go and get a new database. Don't think of the blockchain as just being a database. We're probably getting a bit onto more safer, firmer ground when we think of it as an exchange technology, lowering transaction costs. But there too, it probably is not the great comparative advantage compared to other mechanisms. My colleagues and I very much believe that the blockchain is an institutional technology primarily. It lowers information costs, and it specifically lowers trust costs. And from, I think it's about 2016, The Economist magazine had a front cover story where they said the blockchain is a trust machine. That describes precisely what the blockchain is. It is a trust machine. And this goes back to the Matilda clip, which I showed you at the very beginning of the lecture, is that who do you trust? Why do you trust them? How do you trust them? What information do you have that they have, or that you have that they don't have, or even worse, that they have that you don't have? These are actually the things that are important in economic transactions. What is even better is that there already exists a very large body of economic theory that examines the consequences of information costs and transaction costs. Associated with the work of Ronald Coase, who was the 1990 Economics Laureate, and Oliver Williamson, the 2009 Economics Laureate. There's a whole bunch of other economists who've done a lot of good work in this area as well. Armin Elkin, Harold Demsetz, these sorts of people. But Coase and Williamson are actually Nobel Prize winners. So these arguments around trust and the importance of information and what have you are not sort of fringe ideas or fringe theories in economics. Now some people might say, well, they're not really mainstream either, but certainly they are very highly respected and respectable theories when you've got them more or less being posited by Nobel Prize winners. So why are economists excited? Why am I excited about this as opposed to accountants being excited? And I have to say, I tend to find economists tend to be a bit more excited about the blockchain than accountants very often are. But here it is. The economic problem is a coordination problem. Now, if you've studied economics at an undergraduate level, you've probably heard that the economic problem following Paul Samuelson is about what is to be produced, who is to produce it, how is it to be produced, who gets the surplus value and all that sort of stuff. That's not an economic problem. The economic problem is, how do we coordinate economic activity between individuals operating under the division of labor? And how is it, when you've got distributed information and positive transaction costs, including trust costs, how is it that we are all able to trade with each other? We're all able to interact with each other. We're all able to go about our lives doing our own thing, and yet somehow it all seems to fit together like a jigsaw puzzle. How is it that when I go to the supermarket, there is lots of stuff that are available for me to buy? Even if I don't want to buy all of it myself, there'll be somebody else wanting to buy it. How is all of that economic activity coordinated? And the next time you go to the supermarket, just have a look around and think, wow, how did this happen? It didn't happen by magic. There's all the stuff to buy at prices you can afford, and that some stuff you want to buy, some stuff you don't want to buy, but nonetheless there's something for everybody. That didn't happen by magic. That happened through coordination. Now, before 2009, there were two ways to coordinate, broadly speaking: prices and markets, or hierarchy. Now, hierarchy is government, firms, trusted third parties. After 2009, there's prices and markets, there's hierarchy. All of these things that were before are still here, and now on top of it, there's distributed ledgers. There is another mechanism to facilitate economic coordination. Which brings us to the electronic markets hypothesis posited by Thomas Malone of MIT in the United States. Now, Malone and several co-authors had several goes at trying to explain this. And their theory that the computer revolution, or they call it the ICT revolution, information communications technology revolution, that it started up in the 1960s and was going full blow by the late 1980s, early 1990s, they made the argument that this was going to revolutionize our society in exactly the same way that I'm saying to you now. Blockchain is going to revolutionize our society. So if Thomas Malone was wrong about this 30 years ago, why am I right about it now? Well, first of all, I want to make the argument that Thomas Malone wasn't really wrong about it, but his argument more or less was that the overall effect of ICT technology would increase the proportion of economic activity occurring in markets as opposed to hierarchy. And in a 1991 paper, actually puts his finger exactly on the issue. He says that the computer networks will not be remembered for their computing power, but will be remembered for their coordination technology. So, did that really happen? Well, yes and no. We can see the electronic markets hypothesis at work in modern platform economies. So Facebook, Amazon, Google, or Alphabet, if you prefer to call them that, they are all what we call two-sided markets, platform economies. They have to simultaneously meet the needs of diverse groups of interest groups at the same time, buyers and sellers, for example, interacting with each other. And the argument is that people look at these and say, oh no, Facebook, Amazon, Google, Alphabet, these are massive corporations, massive hierarchies. How could that possibly be consistent with Thomas Malone's electronic markets hypothesis? Well, in actual fact, if you look within these organizations, there are actually really very strong market processes happening within them. Their model also relies very much on them creating markets to operate. So it's not as clear cut as what people were thinking in the late 1980s, early 1990s. But nonetheless, I look at platform economies and think, yeah, that is consistent with Malone's story, if not actually his story. But the way that they work is that they are information brokers. They provide information to both sides of the market. They take a clip, of course, and all that sort of stuff. But they are information brokers. And traditional platforms, they've actually been around for a long, long time, even though people haven't thought of them as being platforms. It's only since the work of Jean Tirole, the 2014 Nobel Prize winner, that the people have thought much about platforms in the way we currently do. But banks, for example, match borrowers and lenders. The media been matching consumers and advertisers for years and years and years. And if we look at these new platforms, what they have done is very much disrupted the current media functions and operations. Traditional media, as we currently know it, is in crisis all around the world because their basic model has been disrupted. Well, the good news or the bad news, depending on your perspective of the world, is that banks will also be disrupted going forward. I very much see that they will be disrupted by blockchain-enabled or blockchain-backed organizations and entities. But now, having a look at our story, so what happened to the electronic markets hypothesis? Well, in a book chapter of a few years ago, 2003, Malone actually set out the 3 conditions that you needed to have for the electronic markets hypothesis to work. Now, first of all, he says you've got decision information, you have to have motivation. So decision information is basically situations where you've got local knowledge. Motivation is when you've got local decision makers who are actually motivated to do the right thing. And then you have trust. Now, what my colleagues and I have done is we looked at Malone's story and we said, yep, local information is a thing discussed by the Nobel Prize winner Friedrich von Hayek. Local decision makers being motivated to do the right thing, incentivized to do the right thing, was discussed in a lot of detail by the great Austrian economist Ludwig von Mises. And then there's trust. Now, Malone's writing in 2003, and in 2003 he's saying to people, trust is important. But in 2003 we didn't have Satoshi Nakamoto's blockchain. We did not have Satoshi Nakamoto's insight. Or if Satoshi Nakamoto had their insight, they hadn't told anybody about it until 2008. So what was missing from Malone's electronic markets hypothesis in the 1980s and 1990s was this notion of industrialized trust. So we now have the 3 conditions, the 3-legged stool, if you want to think of it in that way, the 3 conditions necessary to make the electronic markets hypothesis work in the way which Malone imagined it would work are now in place. Which is why I think it didn't quite work out the way he anticipated in the 1990s and 1980s, but now going forward you might actually be able to do that. And so what we see, what we expect, is to see more markets and less hierarchy. And what we're calling the V-form network or the V-form organization, instead of having large vertically integrated firms, hierarchy, moving goods and services across internal supply chains, we actually anticipate in future we will have a supply chain which is built up or built upon some sort of distributed ledger system, and we will have firms plugging into that supply chain, providing goods and services to people as and when they need them. So we've written a lot of stuff on this. Go and have a look at the end. I've got some references at the end of the lecture. Go and have a look at that if you're really interested in these ideas. All right, so I've told you why people are excited. I've told you why I am excited. Let me tell you why people are worried. People are worried about the the digitalization of our economy, and some of these concerns are more or less real, and some of them less so. I found this list of the survey results of what people were worried about. I was surprised by the ranking of the list. I kind of thought that people would be worried about their own jobs more than they actually are. People are less worried about losing their jobs, only 54% of respondents. People are worried about their personal data. Your personal data is not secure. So if you have a look at, say, the top 3 or 4, so the top 2 and then the medical records one, people are worried about privacy. Now, privacy means a lot of different things, but more or less, in this particular context, privacy does not mean solitude, the right to be left alone. What people are worried about here is control of their data about themselves in the public domain. This is a challenge. This is a problem. A lot of people worry a lot about this. Can I point out to you that in this particular instance, you're between the devil and the deep blue sea, because there's this great paradox. Everybody carries on, big tech is collecting data about us. Yes, they are, probably. Government is also collecting data about you. So somebody is collecting data about you. And a lot of people say, well, they don't trust big tech, they trust the government. That's probably not a wise way of thinking about it. Neither is it wise to say, well, I trust big tech and I don't trust the government. We should almost certainly be taking on the view that you shouldn't trust either of big tech or big government about your own private information, and that nonetheless big government will provide some solutions which may be good or bad, and big tech will provide some solutions which may be good or bad. But certainly that is going to be a minefield that we're all going to have to navigate over the next few years. Other things people are worried about, we kind of touched on already, loss of economic opportunity. I was surprised how low that was on the list. I would have thought that would be slightly higher up on the list. Then there's some conspiracy theories. I love a good conspiracy theory. I really enjoy them. You'll find me very often debating with people, the moon landing and all this sorts of stuff. It's all good fun. But Order 66. This is from Star Wars. In the third movie, the Revenge of the Sith, evil Emperor Palpatine, or soon-to-be Emperor Palpatine, gives an order to all the clone warriors. He says to them, execute Order 66. And in one of the saddest scenes of the movies, you see all the clone warriors killing the Jedi Knights. So this is the idea that somehow built into the technology is some mechanism for evil Emperor Palpatine or somebody like that to take over control of the world. As I say, I love a good conspiracy theory, but the problem with this particular conspiracy theory is whether or not you've got open source software. If you've got open source software, it's very hard to hide Order 66 into the technology. What about Skynet? Now, Skynet is from the Terminator movies. Now, you all know in the Terminator movies, the robot comes back from the future to kill the mother of his worst enemy in the future, before the character is born. Okay, now, in this particular story, what has happened is Skynet is actually the villain. Skynet is a defense program which becomes sentient and realizes that humans are the enemy and decides to start killing the humans. Very similar storyline to the Matrix movies. In the Matrix movies, the machines, the evil machines, take control of the world and start mining humans for their energy. And there's only those humans who are able to sort of break control and sort of start fighting back. I don't want to say that these are not ever going to happen, but I do want to say that I'm not very worried about this. There's a huge difference between what humans can do and what machines can do. Machines can compute faster than humans. Machines never break the rules. Machines never innovate. Machines never change the game. So so very often people say, gee, a machine beats the world chess champion, or machines are better at a game called Go than any other human, and so on and so forth. Yes, a machine can play a game better than a human, but the machine will never invent a new game. Certainly not at the moment. So I'm not worried about these sorts of things. And also, I'm quite convinced the Americans sent astronauts to the moon. But nonetheless, as I say, I love good conspiracy theories, and they are good fun, but entertainment value only. What you should be worried about if you are going to be thinking about the blockchain in any serious sense is the erosion of established hierarchies. What the blockchain does and what the electronic markets hypothesis promises is that we will have more markets and less hierarchy. So if you are a big fan of hierarchy, if you think hierarchy is important, and since the Industrial Revolution hierarchy has been important, those things are going to change. So a lot of hierarchy in our world around us is people monitoring and checking up and making sure that things are happening. They're facilitating trust, ensuring trust, and so on. A lot of those jobs are actually in trouble. Now, my colleagues and I estimate that about 35% of all jobs in the American economy exist to facilitate trust. A lot of those jobs are probably going to be replaced over time. Now, what I'm saying here is not that all accountants will lose their jobs, but many auditors will lose their jobs. Not all regulators will lose their jobs, but many functions of regulation will be subsumed into the blockchain. So those sorts of functions, supervisory roles, are probably going to disappear over time. But that just tells us that accountants and lawyers and what have you will be doing other things. Their jobs will change. They will evolve into other functions. But the stock standard surveillance and auditing kind of functions will probably decline over time. So let's talk about the application. So that's just some of the ideas, what it is very briefly, why we're excited, things we could be worried about but probably shouldn't worry about too much. What about the applications? So here are some of the applications I want to touch on in this lecture. First of all, money. Now, of course, the blockchain was invented to keep track of money. So we have the Bitcoin, the cryptocurrency on the blockchain. So let's just think about what is money. And again, if you were in the class with me right now, I would reach into my wallet, I would take out a $50 bill and say, you all know what money is. Here it is. Look at it. And I would show you the $50 bill. And we will say, okay, is this really money? And the answer is no. That $50 bill is not money. Now, I'm not going to give it to you for nothing or give it away for nothing, even though I've just declared to you it's not money. But in actual fact, that $50 bill is not really money. Now, what do I mean by not really money? Now, the answer really is money is an institution. Money lives in our minds. That $50 bill, it's not paper money, it's actually plastic. That $50 bill, that paper money, the plastic money, is a representation of money. Money lives in our minds. You could almost say money is the greatest mass delusion in human history, because we all agree, most of us agree, that piece of plastic is worth $50. And we all know intellectually that it's not really worth $50. But nonetheless, if I give that piece of plastic to you and you hold it in your hand, you can now actually buy $50 worth of goods and services in the economy. So money is actually what we think it is. Now, why is it that over history, certain things have been money and other things haven't been money? Now, there is a huge array of different things that have been considered to be money. And almost every single human society in human history has had an idea of money, or the idea of a single thing that can be swapped or bartered for all other things. So money, or what becomes money, has got three interrelated characteristics. One, it is a medium of exchange. It is actually the thing that we swap one thing for another. Two, it is a store of value. And three, it is a unit of account. Now, unit of account means that prices are denominated in that thing. Store of value means that that thing is just as valuable today as it was yesterday, as it will be tomorrow. Now, a lot of people confuse store of value. They kind of think to be a store of value, it must be growing up in value. Now, something that goes up in value is an asset. Now, an asset might be used as money, but an asset is not actually money. You don't want your asset, your value of your money to be fluctuating very much. You do want the value of your asset to be fluctuating. Ideally, you want it to be going up. But nonetheless, a store of value is actually that your currency, your money must be stable. You don't want it going up too much because that gives you an incentive to you don't want the value of it going up too much because that gives you an incentive to hoard it, and you don't want the value of it going down too much because that gives you an incentive to spend it right now. Okay, so that $50 bill that I held up in front of the class and say, okay, is this really money? And we all said it is money, and I've just said, no, it isn't really money. Governments issue that to function as money. And I'm going to argue on the next slide. I don't want to upset too many people, but I'm going to argue on the next slide. In actual fact, government money works pretty well for what it is and what it does. But we have to ask ourselves is, do we have to have money being issued by a government? Is money, or government money, a public good? Now, I don't mean good for the public. Public good has got a very specific definition in economics, in that it's non-excludable and non-rival. So I can't stop you from using it, and my use of it doesn't prevent your use of it. So the three functions of money: is it a unit of account? Yep, they are both non-excludable and non-rival. Is it a store of value? More or less, yes, it's non-excludable, non-rival. Of course, bearing in mind, if I'm holding this particular $50 bill in my hand, that means you are not holding it. But that doesn't mean that the use of Australian dollars is not non-rival. But what when it comes to medium of exchange? Now, it's only non-excludable because it's only excludable because it's legal tender. So in Australia, we've got a law. And the law says that Australian dollars can be used to settle all bills. They are legal tender. Now, and accounts. Now, it's very interesting because if you've been on a budget airline in the last while, you would have seen them. They sell drinks and food and snacks and what have you on the plane, and very often they will say, we only take credit cards. They don't take Australian cash. If you've been to many stores during the COVID crisis, very often they have a sign on the door saying, we do not accept cash, we only take cards. Strictly speaking, that's violating Australia's legal tender laws. You cannot refuse to take cash in Australia. Of course, there's no enforcement mechanism because it never occurred to legislators that anybody would ever refuse to take cash. But it's one of these very interesting quirks that I always look at this and thinking, oh, strictly speaking, that's not allowed. And of course, money has network effects. Australian dollars are valuable to me in Australia because I know they are valuable to you. This goes back to this great mass delusion that we all share, that these pieces of plastic are valuable in and of themselves. So money doesn't have to be issued by the government. And throughout large periods of human history, money wasn't issued by government. It's only been in the last couple of 100 years that governments have really established a monopoly over money. Now, why do governments issue money? Well, first of all, to facilitate trade and to make the world a cheaper place to operate. It is useful if we all agree on what is money. I mean, that all makes sense. So there are those public choice type aspects. It's good, it's valuable, it's useful. At the same time, of course, it also gives government control over the economy. By manipulating the money supply, they can achieve certain outcomes. But if we think about what are the costs and benefits of a government money compared to a non-government money. Now, what I've got there is two diagrams. The one on the left-hand side is the simple diagram. That line between private money and fiat currency, government money, is known as an institutional possibilities frontier. And on the y-axis, we are measuring the costs of disorder, the bad things people do to each other. And on the x-axis, we are measuring the costs of dictatorship, the bad things governments do to people. Now, Bad things that people do to each other, obviously we know, lie, steal, cheat, murder, all these sorts of things. But when it comes to money, if you've got a private money, what's the bad thing that could happen to you? Well, the bad thing could happen to you is that a private money could be counterfeited, or that the person who issued the private money could default. So they refuse to honor the value of their money. From a government perspective, what's the bad thing that happens to a fiat currency? Well, we get inflation. And sometimes we get some bailouts and economic manipulation of money supplies and what have you. But certainly the big problem, the big dictatorship cost of government money is inflation. So normally people would say, oh, terrible, all these high government costs. Why is it then that people, generally speaking, are happy to hold the government's money and don't hold private money? And the answer my colleagues and I have come up with is more or less, you can hedge inflation. You can't hedge counterfeiting risk and you can't hedge default risk by the private money provider, but you can hedge against inflation. So in actual fact, people are happy to hold government money as long as they can hedge against inflation. When they can't hedge against inflation, then we observe in countries around the world that people flee from government money to other types of money. And we've seen this in Zimbabwe and Venezuela and these sorts of places where you have got high levels of inflation, people actually substitute away. So generally speaking, around the world, people are happy to hold government money. It works well. And one of the ways that it works well is it's convenient to use. What's happening with viable cryptocurrencies? Well, with a viable cryptocurrency, you can actually do away with the counterfeiting risk because you've solved the double spending problem. And through judicious use of smart contracts, you can probably also do away with the default risk. So we could actually have a private money with much lower disorder costs and also much lower dictatorship costs. So we could actually have genuine competition with around money between cryptocurrencies and fiat currency, government money. Now, why hasn't this happened yet? Well, the reason it hasn't happened yet is because government money is still convenient to use. Whereas cryptocurrencies to date have not been convenient to use. It is actually quite hard to operate a Bitcoin account. It is hard to trade in Bitcoin. But the Facebook consortium bringing out their Libra currency, which they promised next year, I imagine it'll be delayed now. There's also been a lot of regulatory pushback against that. But nonetheless, the Libra currency promised to actually be convenient to use. So if you can operate a Facebook account, which even my mum can operate a Facebook account, if you can operate a Facebook account and you can send people messages in Messenger, you will very quickly be able to send Libra to people as well. So I'm quite confident that convenient to use cryptocurrencies are just around the corner. What about record keeping? Now, this is, to my mind, an incredibly exciting area because right now there's a lot of identity theft, a lot of identity fraud and all sort of stuff. But can you just imagine that if we start recording birth certificates, death certificates, citizenship, qualifications, all these things on the internet, you will very quickly get to a situation where it is much harder, on the blockchain, it'll be very quickly get to a situation where it is much, much harder to steal somebody's identity, to create a fake identity. What is also very exciting about this is that previously you haven't been able to separate your right to privacy and secrecy. If you wanted to keep something private, you also had to keep it secret. Whereas now you will be able to separate your privacy and your secrecy. Now just imagine the following situation. You get pulled over by a policeman and the policeman says to you, do you have a driver's license? And you say yes, and what do? You hand over your driver's license. That policeman now knows your name, your age, your address, and whether or not you've got a driver's license. Now, can you imagine in a future world where you simply hold out your phone or your device, whatever it is, and the policeman holds their device, and it simply gives back yes, no. Do you have a driver's license? Yes. Or no, as the case may be. And yet, with this mechanism, you haven't had to tell the policeman your name, your age, your your address and all that sort of information, because they don't need to know that information. So you could have you could live in a world, a blockchain empowered world, where we have these things called zero knowledge proofs, whereby the machine will tell the other machine that yes, you can or can't do this. We'll be able to see this in medical records. We'll be able to see this in taxation, and all these sorts of things. So, right now you have to hand over your tax return for some or other reason. In future, all you have to do is say, yes, I'm compliant, or no, I'm not compliant. So trade. This is actually one of the more interesting and exciting areas where blockchain is almost immediately being applied. Now, in the last 70 years or so, there have been two very, very important innovations which have occurred in the space. The first one is the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which came in after the Second World War and evolved into the World Trading Organization, which led to great standardization of rules around the world in terms of trade and getting rid of tariff barriers and all this sort of stuff. So there was standardization around the rules. The other thing that happened was containerized shipping, which dramatically lowered transportation costs around the world. And that's led to the explosion in global trade, which we have seen since the end of the Second World War. So great levels of standardization occurred around containers and around rules. We're now going to see with the blockchain great levels of standardization around information. Information will be able to travel with goods and services as they move around the world. So what happens at the moment is information is lost. Very often information is written on pieces of paper. We still live in a world where goods and services cross international borders and people are handing over pieces of paper, handwritten pieces of paper to boot. It's quite amazing. So the blockchain will actually be able to keep track of goods and services around the world as they trade. This is an incredibly exciting area. So it's the information that's important. If you think about things, for example, more Australian beef is sold in China than we actually export. So there are phenomenally high levels of fraud taking place where people say, yeah, this is Australian beef, when in actual fact it is not. I've been astonished to discover that there is a massive world market for fake wine, so fake French wine. Incredible. It's if you just kind of think that there are unscrupulous people selling goods and services at premiums, when in actual fact it's just straightforward fraud. So where does my wine come from? How old is this meat? Is this product really organic? Is this a genuine pharmaceutical product? I mean, that's an astonishingly important question. Is this exactly what it says it is? And of course, consumers want this information, firms want this information, governments and regulators all want this information. I was in Scotland a few years ago and I was drinking a Scotch flavoured cider, and I contacted the company and I said to them, look, I'm from Australia. I really enjoyed your product. Where can I buy it in Australia? And they said to me, if you ever see our product for sale in Australia, please contact us and let us know, because they simply sell their product to distributors who then distribute it around the world. So they've got no idea where their final consumers are. They've no idea what people are buying and where they're buying it and why they're buying it. I mean, you can imagine that information, which is incredibly valuable, is actually lost to the company. So the blockchain will be able to solve those problems very quickly and easily in the future. And here is an example of a trial between IBM and Maersk on selling flowers, which are grown in Kenya and then traded into the Rotterdam markets almost overnight. And it actually shows you, it works its way through the whole blockchain example, how it would work, who's doing what, and what the advantage of. And again, I would strongly urge you, go and have a look at the YouTube clip, or again, if you actually have my slides, just click on the picture and it'll take you to the YouTube clip. So to conclude, blockchain, distributed ledger technology is a very exciting innovation in the use of ledgers, which is a way of storing value, maintaining consensus over value. Ledgers are an important part of our economic institutions, which we hadn't thought about too much before. Blockchains will revolutionize Blockchains will revolutionize society and economy along the lines of the electronic markets hypothesis because they actually industrialize trust. That is what was missing from the electronic markets hypothesis before, and that is what is present now. And if you really enjoyed this and want to learn more, please have a look at the sources. My papers are up at SSRN. My colleagues and I have got several op-eds and ideas at Medium. And then 3 of the important papers we've written in this particular area, explaining many of the ideas that you have heard in this lecture. Thank you very much.